Well, Adam Smith once, you're supposed to worship him but not read him, but it's worth reading too. He once remarked somewhere that if you find two businessmen talking to each other, they're involved in a conspiracy against the public, something like that. And yeah, there's something to that, but it's not as though, you can read descriptions like what you're saying, incidentally, in the business press. So for example, in the Financial Times in London, which is like the main, the most important business newspaper in the world, a couple of years ago they had an article by the economics correspondent of the BBC, it's all very establishment stuff, in which he said that something like this, that what's evolving is what he called a de facto world government in a new imperial age. And the de facto world government is a set of shadowy institutions. They're there, you sort of know they're there, but you don't know what they're doing. Which basically serve the interests of transnational capital and financial institutions. And he said, for example, the G7, the 7 big rich countries, meaning just their executives, and their leadership. Nobody else knows what they're doing. The IMF, the World Bank, then the GATT Council, now it would be the World Trade Organization, and yeah, they get together and they're running a de facto world government. I think that's kind of a, it's kind of a metaphor. It's not that they get together somewhere and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. They do get together, but it's usually extremely boring. Like if you were unfortunate enough to have gone to this Davos conference the other day, I'm sure you would have been bored out of your mind. I didn't go and I didn't see the document, but having read things like I do a lot of reading of this stuff. Like the Trilateral Commission is one of them, and they publish regular documents. So boring. After a couple of years, I stopped subscribing. It was so predictable and boring and pablum and so on and so forth. And besides, you can read it in Foreign Affairs or the New York Times business page or wherever you want any day. But yes, they do get together, and sometimes when things get scary, they really do things. So say take the Trilateral Commission. The one publication of theirs which really is interesting and worth reading. This is the commission that was put together by David Rockefeller around 1973, and it's one of the ones that people refer to when they talk about this, secret nexus of rulers and so on. Although, as I say, it's mostly a bore. But in 1975, the first publication was very interesting. And I'd urge you to read it if you haven't done it. It's called The Crisis of Democracy. And it's very much in line with the kind of stuff I was talking about before. Remember, this is the first getting together after the 60s. Okay, all this ferment went on in the 60s, which, women and minorities and all kind of people are supposed to be kept in their place were suddenly trying to get into the public arena and do something about their interests. And that, again, drove people crazy, just as did the working class struggles in the 30s. So here you have a gathering of elites. Trilateral means United States, Europe, and Japan. So these are elite elements, mostly liberal, on the liberal side, incidentally. Like if you look at the composition, it's around, roughly speaking, around Carter Democrats. In fact, the whole Carter administration, including Carter himself, was drawn from this group. That's roughly the complexion, both in all 3 of the countries. And they were concerned about what they called the crisis of democracy. And it's interesting to read what they said, because at that point they were concerned. The crisis of democracy is the fact that normally passive and marginalized parts of the population, the overwhelming majority, are suddenly trying to get into the public arena to press their demands. Well, like if you believe the stuff they teach you in civics classes, that's supposed to be democracy. But if you're smart enough to have made it to Harvard, you know that that's the crisis of democracy, and we got to stop it. And in fact, the American rapporteur, the guy who wrote the U.S. part of it, is a professor at Harvard. Shortly after he got one of my favorite titles, he was called Professor of the Science of Government at Harvard. I've always liked that one. Sam Huntington, yeah. I think he's now a university professor or something. But he wrote the American side of this trilateral thing. But the others are more or less the same. I don't mean to suggest he's different. I think he's a kind of like a New Deal Democrat or something, probably, isn't he? Something like that. He's like we're not talking about Jesse Helms. Okay, this is in fact, he gave his ideal, described the good old days. Sort of let his hair down a little. He said in the good old days, he said before the crisis of democracy, He said Truman had been, this is almost a quote, Truman had been able to run the country with the help of a few Wall Street lawyers and financiers. Okay, that's that alleged conspiracy you're talking about. Of course, he's exaggerating. You know, it wasn't just Truman and a bunch of Wall Street lawyers and financiers. But that's the image. That would be perfect. If we had that, there'd be no crisis of democracy. But when you have women and blacks and young people and old people and farmers and all these scum trying to get into the public arena, yeah, that's a problem. Exactly the problem that Madison worried about, in fact. So you got to somehow marginalize them. All right, in this case, they were public. I mean, it is public in a way. I mean, that is, you can read it. You got to work a little to find it, and it's worth reading. But most of the stuff is, it's very boring. It's like the literature of social science. It's hard work. I mean, you got to do it if you feel a duty, you know.